Imagine waking up one morning and finding out that a soda company had somehow become linked to 17 Soviet submarines, a cruiser, a frigate, and a destroyer. Not in a parody, not in a video game, in real life. For a brief moment at the end of the Cold War, Pepsi was tangled up in one of the strangest business deals in modern history. A deal so absurd that people still repeat it today like it has to be fake. And honestly, part of it is exaggerated. But the truth is somehow even better. Because this is not just a story about soft drinks. It is a story about superpowers, collapsing economies, Cold War symbolism, barter deals, vodka, propaganda, and the moment a capitalist brand pushed so deeply through the Iron Curtain that the Soviet Union ended up paying with ships. And the craziest part is this: Pepsi did not win this through military power. It won through consumer desire. To understand how insane this became, you have to go back to 1959. Moscow, the American National Exhibition. This was supposed to be a giant showcase of American life. Appliances, kitchens, consumer goods, all the polished comforts of capitalism put on display inside the Soviet Union. It was there that Richard Nixon and Nikita Khrushchev had their famous kitchen debate, arguing over which system could build the better future. And nearby, Pepsi executive Donald Kendall saw an opening. He wanted one thing: to get a Pepsi into Khrushchev's hand. And he did. Khrushchev sampled Pepsi at the exhibition while photographers captured the moment. The image spread everywhere. For Pepsi, it was a marketing miracle. For the Soviets, it was a glimpse of Western consumer culture wrapped in sugar, fizz, and branding. That single photo became the beginning of a relationship that would take more than a decade to fully mature. And right there is the first lesson of the story. Sometimes history doesn't move first through armies. Sometimes it moves through symbols people want to touch. That moment in 1959 did not instantly open the Soviet market, but it planted the seed. After years of negotiation, Pepsi finally landed the breakthrough in 1972. And by 1974, Pepsi became the first American consumer product to be produced, marketed, and sold in the Soviet Union. Think about how massive that is. Not a tractor, not industrial machinery, not some obscure technical import, a cola. One of the most visible symbols of American consumer culture entered the USSR before the Cold War was even over. There was just one huge problem. The Soviet ruble was not freely convertible on international markets, which meant the Soviets could not simply pay Pepsi in the normal way. So both sides had to get creative, and this is where the story takes its first weird turn. Instead of cash, Pepsi got the rights to distribute Stolichnaya vodka in the United States. So for years, the deal was basically this: Pepsi syrup and bottling infrastructure went east. Soviet vodka went west. It sounds bizarre now, but at the time it worked brilliantly. Pepsi got market access. The Soviets got a wildly desirable American brand, and both sides found a way around a financial system that made ordinary payment almost impossible. This was not just business. This was Cold War barter on a cinematic scale, and Pepsi did not just enter the Soviet Union. It exploded. By the late 1980s, around 1 billion servings of Pepsi a year were being sold across the USSR. Contemporary reporting said Pepsi already had 24 bottling plants there and planned to expand to 50. For a lot of Soviet consumers, Pepsi was not just a drink. It was a taste of something foreign, modern, and aspirational. That matters more than people realize. Because the Cold War was never only about missiles and ideology, it was also about everyday life. Who had better cars, better kitchens, better music, better clothes, better food, better dreams. And Pepsi understood something profound. If people begin to crave the lifestyle attached to your product, you are no longer just selling a drink. You are selling a worldview. That is why this story is bigger than a corporate anecdote. It is one of the clearest examples of how consumer culture can become geopolitical leverage. So here is a question for the comments. What tells you more about the late Cold War, nuclear stockpiles, or the fact that Soviet citizens wanted American soda badly enough for this entire chain of events to happen? But the vodka for cola arrangement did not last forever, because geopolitics got in the way. After the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979, Soviet products in the U.S. became harder to sell, and Stolichnaya was hit by consumer backlash and boycott pressure. That mattered because Pepsi's entire workaround depended on vodka remaining a useful payment vehicle in the American market. And that is where the story starts tipping from unusual into unbelievable. The Soviet Union still wanted Pepsi. Pepsi still wanted to expand. But the old method of payment was getting weaker. So the question became, if the Soviets could not reliably pay in cash and vodka was no longer enough, what exactly could they pay with? The answer somehow was ships. Not because Pepsi wanted to become a military power, not because executives suddenly dreamed of commanding fleets, but because in a system starved of hard currency, barter becomes desperate, and desperate systems start making deals that sound like satire. This is the part where history stops sounding like history and starts sounding like a script nobody would believe if you pitched it. In 1989, Pepsi became involved in an arrangement that included 17 Soviet submarines, plus a cruiser, a frigate, and a destroyer. The vessels were old, decommissioned, and destined for scrap, with a Norwegian partner involved in handling the maritime side of the deal. That is the core fact behind the legend. Yes, Pepsi really did end up connected to Soviet warships. Yes, that actually happened. But here is where most retellings get sloppy. This did not mean Pepsi became a real naval force in any meaningful military sense. The ships were not some gleaming battle fleet ready to sail under a Pepsi flag. They were aging assets, effectively scrap. Pepsi was acting far more like a broker and financial workaround than a soft drink admiralty. Still, let's be honest, the image is too good to die. A cola company owning Soviet submarines at the end of the Cold War. That is the kind of fact people repeat forever, because it feels like the world briefly broke character. And maybe that is why this story still spreads so well online. It compresses the collapse of an empire into one perfect sentence. The Soviet Union wanted Pepsi so badly, it paid with warships. Now let's deal with the biggest myth head on. Did Pepsi really own the sixth largest navy in the world? Not really. That line is catchy, but it is misleading. One detailed analysis noted that if you counted the 17 submarines by themselves, that would have tied with India for the seventh largest fleet of attack submarines at the time. But in any real-world sense, Pepsi was not a naval power. These were obsolete, unseaworthy vessels headed for the scrapyard almost immediately. So the smart version of the story is stronger than the meme version, because the truth is not that Pepsi became some legitimate military giant. The truth is that the Soviet economic system had become so distorted, so cash-starved, and so dependent on awkward workaround deals that military hardware could end up functioning like payment. That is not just funny, that is revealing. It tells you something had gone deeply wrong beneath the surface. Not everything in a collapsing empire looks dramatic from far away. Sometimes, collapse looks like submarines being used to settle a soda account. And then came the even bigger expansion. In April 1990, Pepsi announced a $3 billion agreement with the Soviet Union, described at the time as the largest deal of its kind between an American company and the USSR. Contemporary reporting said the arrangement would more than double Pepsi's Soviet bottling network from 24 plants to 50, while using vodka and at least 10 Soviet-built ships as part of the barter structure. Read that again. This was not a one-off joke deal. This was a gigantic commercial strategy built on the idea that Pepsi could keep scaling inside one of the largest markets on Earth through a mix of concentrate, vodka rights, and ships. That is how deep the relationship had become. And if you are wondering why Coca-Cola did not dominate this space first, Pepsi had a huge head start. Coca-Cola only entered the Soviet market later, with reporting in 1985 describing Coke's arrival as the end of Pepsi's roughly 10-year monopoly there. So this was not just a bizarre trade story. It was one of the strangest chapters in the Cola Wars. Pepsi did not just beat Coke in ads. For a while, Pepsi beat Coke by navigating the economics of a superpower that could not pay normally. And then history did what history does. It moved faster than the deal. In 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed. The political map shattered. Supply chains fractured. Factories, shipping arrangements, materials, and planned investments were suddenly spread across newly independent states. U.S. government history marks 1991 as the year the Soviet state unraveled, and later reporting described how Pepsi's giant Soviet strategy had to be reassembled across the former republics instead of one centralized system. So the weird Pepsi Navy story is not really about corporate absurdity alone. It is also about timing. Pepsi had built a business model around dealing with one massive, rigid empire, and then that empire basically disappeared mid-transaction. That is the hidden ending most people leave out. The submarines are the punchline. The collapse is the point. Because once a state reaches the stage where consumer demand, currency dysfunction, and military leftovers all start blending into one trade mechanism, you're not looking at strength anymore. You're looking at a system improvising its own decline. And maybe that is why this story hits so hard. On the surface, it is hilarious. A soda company with Soviet submarines. A Cold War barter deal involving vodka and warships. A meme before memes existed. But underneath the absurdity is a serious question. What does it say about a superpower when one of the clearest symbols of American influence is not a treaty, not a tank, not a speech, but a soft drink? Because in the end, Pepsi did something propaganda often struggles to do. It made ordinary people want a piece of the other side's world. And once that starts happening, power changes shape. So maybe the real story here is not that Pepsi briefly looked like a navy. Maybe the real story is that consumer culture became powerful enough to move through the cracks of the Cold War before politics could. And that is a terrifyingly modern idea. Because if a bottle can do that, what can an algorithm do now? If you enjoyed this one, subscribe, because history is full of moments that sound fake until you look closely and realize the truth is even stranger. And tell me in the comments, was this the ultimate example of capitalist soft power, or the ultimate sign that the Soviet system was already breaking underneath the surface? And be honest, if you were Coca-Cola in 1990, how do you even compete with a company that can say, yeah, we took payment in submarines?